Hello, fourth graders. Welcome to session 3 of our SSGS Unit 2 on Changemakers. We just left off reading a little bit more about the two perspectives in the American Revolutionary War, thinking about the American colonists and the British. So there was a lot of taxes going on, and we were starting to learn the timeline of when those taxes were being imposed by Britain to England. Today what we'd like to do is take a look at an image. So we're going to be asking ourselves, how do we learn from historical images? There weren't cameras, for example, back in American Revolution time, but there were paintings. Let's take a look at a portrait from the American Revolutionary time, and we're going to do 2 looks at it. And what I mean by that is we're going to take a look at it without any real background knowledge and just take in what we notice. Then let's turn to some of our books and sources to learn a little bit more and come back to this image. So as I bring this up and you're taking a look at it, I want you to think to yourself what stands out most. I know for myself, the man pictured right here, that's what stands out most. He basically looks like he's being tortured. If I look even closer, he's covered in white. It looks fluffy, which is bizarre. They look to be pouring something in his mouth. Unfortunately, the other men around him are smiling, so they're enjoying this. I just don't know what's going on. I also seem to notice off in the back, this ship, there's boxes of things being poured into the ocean. And I also notice this is the Liberty Tree. I remember reading about that in our read aloud, Liberty. What we're going to do is pause and kind of just take this in and then go to some sources and come back and see if we have any answers for what's really going on in this photo. So what we're going to do is take a look at this resource, but I'm going to go down to halfway through. So if you were to find the paragraph that begins with the 3 words, "What outraged colonists?" you can follow along. What outraged colonists was not so much as the tax as the fact that it was being imposed from England. Reaction to the Stamp Act in the colonies was swift and on occasion riotous. In Virginia, Patrick Henry made a reputation for himself in a bold speech before the House of Burgesses. "Caesar has his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell," he said. "May George III profit from their example." In Massachusetts, rioters ransacked the home of newly appointed Stamp Commissioner Andrew Oliver. He resigned the very next day. Threatening or attacking the Crown-appointed officer holders became a popular tactic against the act through the colonies. Though no Stamp Commissioner was actually tarred and feathered, the medieval brutality that is, was a popular form of 18th century mob violence in Great Britain, particularly against tax collectors. Tarring and feather dated back to the days of the Crusades and King Richard the Lionheart. It began to appear in New England seaports in the 1760s and was most often used by patriot mobs against loyalists. Tar was readily available in shipyards, and feathers came from handy pillows. Though the cruelty invariably stopped short of murder, the tar needed to be burning hot for application. As a reader, I want you to notice how that same image is pictured in the thumbnail here as the one we were analyzing here. The same man is being brutally tarred and feathered. So it seemed that they mentioned Andrew Oliver, the Stamp Commissioner. And when we think about Andrew Oliver, we were first introduced to him in this text at the very beginning here, where it says, "That night, enraged protesters burned a straw effigy of Andrew Oliver, the unlucky official picked to collect taxes." So the tax collectors were the people from England that were nominated to collect these taxes that they imposed on the colonists. The colonists took their aggression and anger out on them, and it seemed to be that the mode that they used for this was tarring and feathering. This other text that we have been looking at in this unit is called Liberty, How the Revolutionary War Began. In this text, it also has a page here about tarring and feathering. So this will also give us a little background knowledge before we go back to our second look at that photo. Before I begin, I just want to point out that if we look at these text features, while it's a cartoon, that might make our mind think this wasn't real, but remember, there weren't cameras back then. So these portraits, cartoons, are depicting the actions we do know that had occurred. And we see some tarring and feathering going on here. The person's actually being hung from the tree. This text feature right here states, John Hancock was said to be the richest man in Boston. He was a loyal son of liberty. Even before the Revolutionary War broke out, the British put him on their most wanted list. One young man spoke sneeringly of the colonies at a quilting party. The girls grabbed him, stripped off his shirt, poured molasses over his head, molasses meaning syrup, and feathered him with the clips of cattail plants. So over here, when we read about tars and feathers, then join in hand, brave Americans all, by uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. So let's read on to see what this text says about tar and feathers. The colonists had rejoiced too soon. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, and these placed high taxes on tea, cloth, and other British goods. Americans were furious. We won't pay, angry men shouted. We won't buy anything from Britain. Colonial women refused to wear British cloth or serve tea. Instead, they made rough homespun cloth and drank coffee smuggled in from the Dutch West Indies. Patriotic women swore never to marry a man who bought British goods. And the Sons of Liberty vowed a horrible revenge against anyone who defied the boycott, tar and feathers. They stripped the offender, poured hot tar over him, and then, to make him look ridiculous, emptied a feather pillow over his head, and feathers stuck to that black tar. The screaming man was carried out of town on a wooden rail and dumped in a ditch. Soon, almost no one would buy British goods. The British and Americans were already furious at each other when an American ship, the Liberty, was seized by British custom agents, that is, on a charge of smuggling. The Liberty was owned by John Hancock, who we mentioned up here earlier, a rich Boston merchant who supported the Sons of Liberty. The news spread quickly. Men raced to the docks. A fight broke out, and the customs agents were beaten up. The British government was outraged at the news. Parliament voted to send troops to the Americans back under control. To get them back under control, that is. In 1768, a squadron of British warships sailed into Boston Harbor. 700 redcoats marched ashore and pitched their tents on Boston Common. Similarly, this reminds me of when John Hancock's boat, the Liberty, was seized, was also the event that we had read about in yesterday's session. So right here it says June 10th, 1768, the crew of a British warship seized a ship owned by this patriot merchant, John Hancock, who was known for smuggling tea and molasses into the city. Talks about that, our fight that went on as a result. So again, as we're reading more and more texts, we're still getting the same information out of it. We can add that date of when John Hancock's boat was seized to our Padlet, but right now I'd like to take time to go back to that image we started with. As we look closer at this, I do notice the caption at the bottom, and it reads, "The Bostonians paying the excise man or the tax collector, or tarring and feathering." So we can now understand that this image is showing a tax collector being tarred and feathered. So they already have been tarred and now they've been feathered. This punishment was done to show their dislike in the taxes. So sometimes as we take a look at a historical image, we have to almost look at it a couple of times. This caption of tarring and feathering could lead me to say, well, then what is tarring and feathering? And then can go get some more resources. The resources we use today were not only this article, we were able to find information from these two texts in here as well. What I'd like for you to do on your own is you're going to continue looking at this slideshow and take a look at the images that are depicted and determine what do you think is happening. You'll notice a lot of similarities, but being that there's different images, maybe there are different clues, different details that help support your understanding of tarring and feathering. What's nice about how this image study works, there's a pair, if you will. So every time you look at an image, the slide right next to it always gives a description. And then if I go to slide 6, there's a description of that. But take a minute to first look and determine what you're noticing. You can even circle some of those details that stand out to you and then confirm them against the caption on the following page. So again, be thinking to yourself, what do we learn from historical images and how does that help deepen our knowledge and even build our curiosity?